Welcome everybody. In today's episode of Hidden History, I will be discussing the Imperial children, the Orphan trains and Tartaria. The social programming of humanity has been happening for more than 250 years, but what if you wanted to create the perfect law-abiding citizen by conditioning and indoctrinating them so they became compliant and obedient? Once the first mud flood had happened around 1740, important social changes began to occur within Imperial Russia. During this time, the famous Russian Empress Catherine the Great conceived the idea that vagrant infants from Great Tartaria could be housed and cared for. Hence, both the Russian Empress and the educational reformer Ivan Betskoy decided that the Moscow orphanage or foundling home should be constructed for such a purpose. The Moscow orphanage, that was also called the Foundling Home, was started on the 1st of September 1763. The inspirational experiment became a part of the Age of Enlightenment and was intended by Catherine the Great and the educational reformer Ivan Betskoy to manufacture communities to the perfect citizens for the Russian state by training and conditioning over 65,000 vagrant infants to a very high standard of cultural refinement, whilst they receive professional qualifications. Despite more than adequate staffing and financing, the Moscow orphanage was not able to initially reduce infant mortality. By the 23rd of April 1869, the Russian Emperor Alexander II, the Russian Council of Ministers and Imperial Russian government collectively decided that some of the infants should be transported into Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. During the many years of upheaval, numerous infants and families would eventually be transported into the eastern United States from Great Tartaria and northern Russia. Within an unusual article that was published on page 3 of the newspaper called The Washington Union, it confirms that Great Tartaria actually existed. The article was published on Tuesday the 13th of February 1849 and reported on how the Tartarian language was established and credible. Indeed, the communities of Tartarian Aryans spoke an Indo-Aryan language which held comparisons with the Uralic language that is known as Magyar. The Tartarian language also contained phonetic and linguistic aspects of the Turkic languages. For nearly 40 years, from the 16th of February 1871 and onward until the 30th of December 1910, about 13.8 million Eastern Europeans immigrated to the United States of America. The majority of these immigrants came from the countries of Eastern Europe, which included Austria, Hungary, Poland and Russia. The majority of the Eastern Europeans who migrated to the United States of America were comprised of Slavic Russians and Tartarian Aryans from northern Russia. Some of these immigrants were Tartarian Aryans that spoke a very archaic Turkic language. Much of this immigration from Eastern Europe began in 1820 and continued for 100 years to 1920. These communities of Turkic people were comprised of the Tartars, the Altians, the Yakuts, the Shufas, and the Tuvans and the Kakas. The extensively managed orphan train movement in the United States, which became so prevalent from 1864 to 1889, were used to relocate many of the parentless infants from Great Tartaria and northern Russia, who had been transported into the eastern United States from mainland Europe. Once the first mud flood caused devastation across the landmass of Great Tartaria in 1740, and then the second mud flood happened in 1834 with the third in 1892. Such events then ensured the communities of Tartarians had to travel from the expanses of Siberia and northern Asia. From the perspective of the Tartarians who had escaped these upheavals, Western Europe and Eastern United States were collectively believed to be the safest areas they could move to. Although there were numerous Eastern Europeans who migrated into Eastern United States that were Slavic Russians, many of them were actually Tartarians who had previously resided in towns and cities across Siberia and northern Asia. The infants and families of Turkic people who moved and sailed on vessels across the North Atlantic Ocean to reach the eastern United States were definitely comprised of Tartars and the Altaians, the Yakuts, the Shuvas, and the Tuvans and the Kakas. Numerous groupings of immigrants from Great Tartaria and northern Russia then settled in eastern United States between 1820 and 1920. Throughout parts of the United States of America, the welfare program, which became known as the Orphan Train Movement, was created so that infants from Eastern Europe and Northern Russia could be transported from the destitute and congested urban settlements in the Eastern United States. Although many of the immigrants had originated from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia, the subversive elites and secret societies deliberately censored that profound truth from Americans because the communities of Tartarian Aryans had become ethically diverse over many generations. This meant that many of them were Turkic people, which explains why the Tartarian Aryans had genetic connections with the Tartars, the Altaians, the Yakuts, the Shuvas, and the Tuvans, and the Kakas, because the immigrants who kept arriving in North America had started to overcrowd the urban settlements of the eastern United States. The infants and families who had come from Great Tartaria and northern Russia had to be relocated. After the infants had been relocated into fostering households across the rural areas in Midwest United States, their former names, identities, and cultural origins were changed. With around 13.8 million Eastern Europeans immigrating to the United States of America from 1871 onwards to 1910, this long-term event therefore showed how the immigration had already been going on before the third mud flood, which seemed to happen in 1892. And would continue to do so long after that upheaval had ended, because the civilization of Great Tartaria was largely destroyed whilst the third mud flood occurred in northern Russia. The numerous Eastern Europeans who eventually migrated into the eastern United States were actually Tartarian Aryans who had travelled from Siberia and northern Asia to escape the geographic upheavals. Although most of the infants from Great Tartaria were red-haired Aryans, some were actually the infants from the Turkic people. Hence, when infants were transported across the North Atlantic Ocean and into New York City and elsewhere in the United States, they had ancestrally originated from the Tartars and the Altaians, the Yakuts, the Shuvas, the Tuvans, and the Kakas. Successive travelling infants from Great Tartaria and northern Russia therefore were transported on vessels across the North Atlantic Ocean, and they covertly began to arrive in the eastern United States on the 17th of April 1820 and continued to until the 15th of October 1920. Once the orphan trains movement began on the 15th of January 1864, over 40 years had passed, and wherefore the infants from the past had become adults in the towns and cities of the eastern United States. The relocation of infants became a socio-economic problem, which therefore only concerned the newcomers to the United States, who then became part of the orphan train movement until it ended on the 20th of December 1889. Once the orphan train movement actually ended, numerous infants from Great Tartaria had been relocated into the mainly rural areas of Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin in the Midwest United States. Even though some of the orphan trains continued to be facilitated until the 17th of April 1929. Most of the infants who had travelled from Great Tartaria had been fully relocated in Midwest United States, where they were given new names and cultural identities. By the 30th of June 1887, the foundling homes in St. Petersburg and Moscow began to receive over 26,500 babies that had been transported from Great Tartaria. From the 31st of December 1882 to the 31st of December 1887. Over 10,500 of these infants were transported every 12 months to outlying villages for care and protection. By the 24th of March 1886, there were around 41,720 infants from the Moscow orphanage that had been placed with 32,000 foster families across 4,418 villages in Western Russia. Once the third mud flood or an equivalent disaster happened around 1892, the rural destruction of some of these farming areas increased, and therefore even more infants had to be rehoused. Although vagrants had been an increasing problem from 1882 to 1887, entire cartloads of Tartarsky Podolsky, the mighty place foundlings, or the Tartarian foundlings, and many groupings of the Russaki Podkidashi, the rowing country foundlings, or the Russian foundlings, were trucked in by women known as the Detay Commissary, the Children Uniters, who were also called the Commissionerki, the United Releasers. These enterprising and caring women knowingly collected unwanted Tartarian foundlings and Russian foundlings in the rural villages and towns, and temporarily cared for them. And then, when enough infants had been gathered so the actual transportation would be profitable, they packed the infants into wagons and hauled them to the urban-based, the Podolsky Doma, the foundling homes. The fees for providing this service were substantial and reportedly provided the United Releasers with a very comfortable income. The famous Russian emperor called Pavel Petrovich Romanov, who became more commonly known as Paul I, and his wife, the elegant Russian empress Maria Fedorovna, continued the social reforms of Catherine the Great. After the Bolshevik Revolution happened on the 25th of October 1917, the Moscow orphanage then closed 3 days later on the 28th of October 1917. Although the London Foundling Hospital was created on the 25th of March 1741 by the philanthropist Captain Thomas Martin Coram, it was actually 15 years later in 1756 that the London Foundling Hospital in Bloomsbury Central London actually began to receive parentless infants. There were as many as 4 separate foundling asylums just in New York City, in which they collectively turning over 4,700 babies every 12 months. Because the problem started to get increasingly worse, the organisers of the London Foundling Hospital decided the only practical solution was to relocate many of the infants overseas, and the eastern United States was believed to be the most viable location to send the infants. As the passenger ships left from Liverpool in northern England, the nearby towns like Southport, Formby and Maghole and Kirby in northwest England were used to temporarily accommodate the infants before they left the United Kingdom of Great Britain to the United States. The various passenger ships in which they were placed sailed between 1852 to 1856, in which they sailed to the eastern United States. Alongside these cultural transitions, some of the Catholic priests from the Spanish Catholic Church placed numbers of orphans into the Casa Huérfano, the foundling homes of Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Seville. Additionally, the Portuguese Catholic Church placed their own vagrant infants at many foundling homes across the urban areas of Lisbon, Porto, Gaia and Amadora in Portugal. Both the landmasses of Spain and Portugal received as many as 16,500 annual parentless infants. That number exceeded 35,000 every 12 months over the duration of 20 years. During the 21st of March 1864, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Spanish government, called Joaquin Francisco Pacheco y Guiatresta Galderano, and the Spanish Catholic Church decided that many of the rejected infants should be quickly sent to the eastern United States. Comparable events occurred in Portugal when the Prime Minister, known as Bernardo de Figueiredo, and the Portuguese Catholic Church decided on the 5th of April 1869 infants from the foundling home should be sent to the United States of America. Between 1852 to 1860, some 425,000 recorded infants who became known as the Bambini Proietti, the thrown away children, rounded the turnstiles in Rome, Milan, Naples, Turin, Palermo and Genoa. Many of these infants had originated from Eastern Europe and therefore Great Tartaria and Northern Russia. During 1867, the decision was made by the Prime Minister Bettino Umberto Ricasoli and the Minister of Foreign Affairs Emilio Visconti Versonto and the Italian government to collectively transport large numbers of infants from the Italian peninsula to New York City in the eastern United States. Across the Italian peninsula, numerous infants were deposited into the Case Trovatella, the foundling homes, by the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican City-State. The socio-economic trend began on the 30th of April 1927, when as many as 34,000 infants were reportedly placed into foundling homes across Rome, Milan, Naples, Turin, Palermo and Genoa every 12 months. The anonymity of the mother had to be kept when it came to their infants to others. Hence, a wooden device called the rotoprotea, the thrown away wheel, or the rototrovatello, the foundling wheel, became socially instituted. The rototrovatello foundling wheel was a large cylindrical box that was installed in the outer walls of the hospital, churches or in the houses of the midwives, into which a newborn infant could be placed. The rototrovatello, the foundling wheel, was then turned so that the baby went inside without anyone being able to observe from the inside who had placed the baby into the cylindrical box. The person leaving the baby then pulled a bell that was near the foundling wheel, which notified the attendant inside that a vagrant infant had arrived. Hence, by using this approach, it meant that Italy ended up having over 1,270 such locations where newborns could be given. So what does the orphan train movement, the foundlings and the baby trains of parentless infants got to do with what is happening presently? Repopulation seems to have repeatedly taken place on a mass scale in the past. Hence, it would make sense that the mud floods were used as the perfect opportunity to repopulate certain locations on planet Earth. From knowing this, it becomes clear as to why the orphan trains movement was used. The destruction of Great Tartaria is therefore historically connected to the cyclical policy of relocation and population, which the elites and secret societies have continually implemented across parts of this planet. The destruction of Great Tartaria is therefore historically connected to the policy of relocation and repopulation. Thank you for watching, everybody. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week.